My sister's husband hasn't worked in 2 years, but somehow her savings keep disappearing. I found the eviction notice wedged under my sister Diana's apartment door on a Thursday morning when I stopped by to drop off groceries. She worked night shifts as an ER physician and usually slept until noon, so I had a spare key for these kinds of visits. The paper was crumpled and dated 3 days prior, giving her 30 days to vacate for non-payment of rent. My hands went cold. Diana made $180,000 a year. Her rent was $2,400 monthly. Something was catastrophically wrong. I knocked harder than usual, and Diana answered, looking worse than I'd ever seen her. Dark circles carved shadows under her eyes, her scrubs hung loose on her frame, and her hair was greasy and pulled back in a messy bun. She tried to smile when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. I held up the eviction notice and watched her face crumble. She grabbed my arm and pulled me inside quickly, glancing down the hallway before closing the door. The apartment was a disaster, with takeout containers piled on every surface, dirty dishes overflowing the sink, and what looked like unpaid bills scattered across the coffee table. "David, we need to talk, but please promise me you won't lose it," Diana said, and her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I'm 34 and Diana is 36, and we'd always been close after our parents died in a car accident when I was 22. She practically raised me those first few years when I was drowning in grief, and she became both sister and guardian to me. Seeing her reduced to this terrified, exhausted version of herself made my chest tighten with rage and fear. I promised I'd stay calm, and we sat down at her kitchen table. Diana explained that her husband, Graham, hadn't worked in exactly 2 years, claiming he was taking time to find himself after burning out from his marketing job. At first, she supported the decision, thinking a few months of rest would help him reset. But months became a year, and a year became 2, and Graham showed no interest in returning to work. Meanwhile, Diana picked up extra shifts to cover their expenses, and her savings started hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. "I had $85,000 saved up 2 years ago," Diana said, staring at her hands. "Last week I checked and there's $3,200 left. I don't understand where it went." She showed me her bank statements on her phone, and I watched decades of careful saving evaporate in a timeline of withdrawals and transfers. Large chunks disappeared every few weeks, sometimes $2,000 at a time, sometimes $5,000. When I asked Diana what Graham said about the missing money, she went quiet for a long moment. Finally, she admitted she'd confronted him multiple times, and he always had explanations. He needed new clothes for job interviews that never materialized. He invested in a friend's startup that mysteriously folded. He paid for online courses to upgrade his skills, but could never show her certificates of completion. Every explanation sounded reasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture of systematic deception. The worst part was that Diana had been hiding this from everyone, including me, because she felt ashamed that her marriage was failing. I asked where Graham was now, and Diana said he was at the gym, which apparently was his daily routine from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. Then he'd come home, shower, and spend the rest of the day gaming or watching television until Diana got home from her shift. She'd arrive exhausted around 8 a.m. after working overnight and find dishes in the sink laundry undone and Graham asleep on the couch. When she tried to talk to him about contributing more at home, he'd accuse her of being controlling and not understanding that he was struggling mentally. Diana kept giving him the benefit of the doubt, kept making excuses, kept working harder to compensate. I looked at my sister sitting there in her dirty apartment, barely keeping herself together, and something crystallized in my mind. Graham was systematically destroying her. This wasn't accidental or the result of depression. This was deliberate, calculated abuse disguised as a partner going through a hard time. "Diana, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "Do you know what Graham does all day? Have you ever followed up on any of his explanations?" She shook her head, looking defeated. She worked 12-hour night shifts 3 to 4 times a week and used her days off to sleep and handle errands. She didn't have the energy to investigate Graham's activities, and part of her didn't want to know the truth because then she'd have to confront what that truth meant for her marriage. I told Diana I wanted to help her figure out what was happening, and she agreed but made me promise not to confront Graham directly. She was scared of how he might react and worried about escalating the situation. I promised to be careful, but internally I was already planning my next move. My friend Kevin worked as a private investigator and owed me a favor from years back when I'd helped him through a rough patch. Kevin agreed to do surveillance on Graham starting the following Monday, and what he uncovered over the next week made my blood boil. Graham's daily gym sessions were real, but they only lasted about 45 minutes. After that, he'd drive to a luxury car dealership where he'd spend hours test driving vehicles he had no intention of buying. The salespeople knew him by name and clearly found him annoying, but tolerated him because he occasionally brought in actual buyers from his social circle. In the afternoons, Graham met up with various friends at expensive restaurants and bars, always picking up the tab and ordering premium drinks. Kevin documented him spending $300 at lunch, $400 at happy hour, $250 at dinner, all on Diana's credit cards. But the real revelation came on Wednesday when Kevin followed Graham to a high-end apartment complex across town. Graham used a key to enter a unit on the 3rd floor and didn't emerge for 3 hours. Kevin managed to get the unit number and ran a property search. The apartment was leased under Graham's name starting 8 months ago, with monthly rent of $3,800. My sister was working herself to death paying for their shared apartment, while her husband maintained a secret second residence across town. Kevin couldn't determine who else had access to the apartment, but the implications were obvious. Graham was either hiding assets, living a double life, or both. When I showed Diana the surveillance photos and lease documents, she vomited into her kitchen sink. She dry-heaved for several minutes, while I rubbed her back, feeling my own rage building to dangerous levels. After she cleaned up, Diana sat on her bathroom floor and told me everything she'd been hiding. 6 months ago, she'd noticed unusual charges on their credit cards, designer clothes she'd never seen Graham wear, jewelry that never appeared in their apartment, expensive dinners at restaurants they'd never visited together. Every time she questioned him, Graham had explanations, and Diana was too exhausted to push back hard. "I'm so stupid," Diana kept saying, and I had to stop her because none of this was her fault. Graham had systematically isolated her through her work schedule, weaponized her exhaustion against her, and exploited her trust. This was textbook financial abuse and emotional manipulation. Diana finally agreed we needed to take action, but she was terrified about the legal and financial implications. She'd been the primary earner for years and worried that Graham would be entitled to alimony or a portion of her remaining assets in a divorce. I called my lawyer friend Rebecca, who specialized in family law, and she agreed to meet with us that evening. Rebecca listened to everything, took notes, and her expression grew darker as Diana's story unfolded. She explained that Diana had a strong case for divorce based on financial abuse, and that we needed to act quickly to protect her remaining assets and document Graham's spending patterns. The first step was freezing all joint accounts and credit cards immediately. That night, while Graham was out, Diana went through their apartment with new eyes looking for evidence she'd previously ignored. She found credit card statements Graham had hidden showing over $60,000 in charges over the past 18 months. Designer clothes receipts for jewelry, expensive electronics, all hidden in a box at the back of their closet. She also found a second phone tucked inside a shoebox, and when she powered it on, her world imploded. The phone contained thousands of text messages between Graham and a woman named Vanessa. The messages went back 2 years, exactly as long as Graham had been unemployed. Vanessa's messages referenced the apartment Kevin had discovered, weekend trips Diana knew nothing about, and shopping sprees funded by Diana's money. Graham's messages to Vanessa were boastful and cruel, describing Diana as his cash machine and joking about how easy it was to manipulate her because she was always too tired to question him properly. Diana called me at midnight, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. I drove straight to her apartment and found her sitting in the dark with the second phone in her hands, reading through messages that destroyed every assumption she'd held about her marriage. The cruelty in Graham's texts was staggering. He called Diana boring and said she was so focused on her career she didn't notice he'd checked out of their marriage years ago. He told Vanessa that Diana's salary meant he could support both of them comfortably without working, and he had no intention of getting a job as long as the money kept flowing. In one particularly vicious exchange, Graham joked about how he'd convinced Diana to skip their couple's therapy sessions by claiming they were too expensive while he was secretly spending thousands monthly on Vanessa. I wanted to drive to that apartment and confront Graham immediately, but Rebecca had been clear that we needed to build our case methodically and avoid any actions that could be used against Diana later. The next morning, Diana called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Rebecca had arranged an emergency meeting with a forensic accountant named Leonard, who specialized in uncovering hidden assets and financial abuse cases. Leonard spent 6 hours going through every bank statement, credit card bill, and financial document Diana could provide. What he uncovered was systematic theft on a scale that shocked even Rebecca, who'd seen plenty of ugly divorces. Over 2 years, Graham had stolen or misappropriated $94,000 from Diana's accounts. Some of it went to obvious luxuries, but Leonard found evidence of cash withdrawals totaling $35,000 that couldn't be tracked. He suspected Graham had a hidden bank account or was converting Diana's money into assets he could conceal. Leonard also discovered that Graham had opened 3 credit cards in Diana's name without her knowledge and maxed them out, accumulating $42,000 in additional debt she didn't know existed. Rebecca immediately filed for an emergency court order to freeze all accounts and prevent Graham from accessing any more of Diana's money. She also filed for divorce, citing financial abuse, fraud, and emotional cruelty. The court granted the temporary restraining order that afternoon, and by 5 p.m., Graham's access to every joint account and credit card was terminated. Rebecca advised Diana to stay with me for a few days while the orders were served, because Graham's reaction would likely be volatile. Diana packed a bag, and we left before Graham came home that evening. Rebecca hired a process server to deliver the divorce papers and restraining order at 7 p.m., when Graham was typically home. The process server reported that Graham became enraged when he realized what was happening, threatening legal action and screaming about how Diana couldn't do this to him. He tried calling her phone, but Diana had blocked his number on Rebecca's advice. Then he tried calling me, and I let it go to voicemail. His message was venomous, calling me a manipulative piece of shit and accusing me of poisoning Diana against him. Over the next 3 days, Graham's behavior escalated in disturbing ways. He showed up at Diana's hospital demanding to speak with her, but security escorted him out when he became aggressive. He posted on social media claiming Diana had a mental breakdown and abandoned their marriage, painting himself as the concerned husband worried about his unstable wife. He contacted Diana's colleagues, spreading lies about her mental state and suggesting she was having an affair with me, which was disgusting on multiple levels. Rebecca filed for an extended restraining order and documented every violation of the temporary order. Meanwhile, Leonard continued his forensic investigation and discovered the cash withdrawals had been going to an offshore account Graham opened in the Cayman Islands. Graham had been systematically converting Diana's money into cryptocurrency and offshore assets he thought would be hidden in divorce proceedings. Leonard estimated Graham had successfully hidden around $50,000 that would require substantial legal effort to recover. The preliminary divorce hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and Rebecca was confident we had an overwhelming case. She'd compiled the surveillance footage, Leonard's financial analysis, the text messages between Graham and Vanessa, and evidence of Graham's harassment since being served. The night before the hearing, Diana and I sat in my living room going through everything one more time. She looked destroyed, but also relieved that the truth was finally out. She admitted she'd known something was wrong for over a year, but kept making excuses because acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging she'd wasted years of her life on someone who viewed her as nothing more than a paycheck. I reminded her that Graham's actions reflected on him, not on her, and that she'd done nothing wrong by trusting someone she loved. That seemed to help a little, though I could see the self-doubt still haunting her eyes. The hearing itself was brutal in its efficiency. Rebecca presented evidence in a clear, methodical manner, and Graham's lawyer, a young associate who looked out of his depth, couldn't mount an effective defense. The judge reviewed the financial records, examined the surveillance photos, and read selected text messages between Graham and Vanessa. His expression grew colder with each piece of evidence. When Graham tried to claim he was entitled to spousal support because he'd sacrificed his career to support Diana's medical training, the judge cut him off sharply. Diana had already been an established physician when they married, and Graham had been employed for the first 3 years of their marriage. His unemployment coincided exactly with the start of his affair and financial theft. The judge ordered Graham to pay Diana $94,000 in restitution, granted Diana full ownership of all remaining assets, and denied Graham any claim to spousal support. He also extended the restraining order for 2 years and ordered Graham to stay away from Diana's workplace and residence. But Graham wasn't done causing damage. 2 days after the hearing, Diana received an email from her hospital's Human Resources Department requesting a meeting regarding serious allegations. Graham had filed a complaint claiming Diana had been stealing medication from the hospital pharmacy to support a drug addiction and that her colleagues had been covering for her. It was a complete fabrication, but one that triggered an automatic investigation under hospital protocol. Diana was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and she was devastated. Being a physician wasn't just her career, it was her identity, and Graham was trying to destroy that too. Rebecca immediately contacted the hospital's legal department, explaining the situation and providing context about the divorce and Graham's harassment campaign. She also filed a police report for filing a false report and harassment. The hospital investigation took 3 weeks, during which Diana spiraled into depression, barely eating or sleeping, and constantly checking her phone for updates. I spent those 3 weeks working with Rebecca and Leonard to build a criminal case against Graham. The offshore accounts constituted fraud and money laundering. The unauthorized credit cards were identity theft. The false report to Diana's hospital was criminal harassment. We compiled everything and presented it to the district attorney's office. The prosecutor assigned to review the case was a woman named Catherine, who had a reputation for taking financial abuse cases seriously. She spent 2 days reviewing our evidence and then called a meeting with Diana, Rebecca, and me. Catherine explained that she could charge Graham with multiple felonies, including fraud, identity theft, and making false statements to law enforcement. The offshore accounts alone carried potential federal charges. She wanted to move forward with prosecution, but needed Diana to be prepared for a lengthy process that would include testimony and cross-examination. Diana agreed without hesitation. She wanted Graham to face consequences not just for what he did to her, but to prevent him from doing this to someone else. The hospital investigation concluded that Graham's allegations were completely baseless, and Diana was reinstated with back pay and a formal apology from the administration. They also banned Graham from hospital property and flagged him in their security system. Diana returned to work, but requested a transfer to a different shift schedule to avoid colleagues who might have heard Graham's accusations. Her reputation was technically intact, but the damage to her confidence was profound. She second-guessed every decision, questioned whether colleagues were whispering about her, and struggled with anxiety attacks during shifts. She started therapy twice weekly, working through the trauma of Graham's betrayal and the impact of his systematic abuse. Progress was slow, but she was making it. Meanwhile, Catherine moved forward with criminal charges, filing a 15-count indictment against Graham that included fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and making false statements. Graham's arrest made local news because of the amounts involved and the calculated nature of the crimes. He was denied bail due to flight risk given the offshore accounts and was held pending trial. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal, but Catherine rejected it, wanting to take the case to trial to establish precedent for financial abuse cases. The trial lasted 8 days, and Diana had to testify for nearly 6 hours. Graham's defense attorney tried to paint Diana as a workaholic who neglected her marriage and drove Graham to seek comfort elsewhere. Rebecca objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most objections, but the implications were clear. Graham was trying to make Diana responsible for his crimes. When I testified about the surveillance and investigation, Graham stared at me with pure hatred. His mask had completely slipped, and the manipulative, charming man who'd fooled my sister was replaced by someone cruel and vindictive. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Graham was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for the fraud and money laundering charges, with additional consecutive sentences for identity theft and false statements totaling 11 years. The judge called his actions calculated, predatory, and showed breathtaking contempt for his victim. Graham was also ordered to pay full restitution, including Diana's legal fees and the cost of the forensic investigation. Leonard managed to recover $43,000 from the offshore accounts, but the rest had been converted to cryptocurrency and moved through exchanges that made it nearly impossible to trace. Diana would likely never see that money again, but the criminal conviction meant Graham would have a felony record that would follow him forever. He'd never work in marketing or any professional field again. His life was effectively over in any meaningful sense. Diana said she should feel satisfied, but mostly she just felt empty. 11 years of prison couldn't give her back the 2 years of her life she'd lost or the $51,000 that was gone forever. The civil divorce was finalized 3 months after the criminal conviction. Diana kept their apartment after Graham's name was removed from the lease, and she slowly began rebuilding her life. She paid off the secret credit cards Graham had opened, drained her retirement account to cover the remaining debt, and started saving again from scratch. The eviction notice never resulted in actual eviction, because Diana caught up on rent as soon as she regained access to her own money, but the experience left her paranoid about finances. She checked her accounts multiple times daily, scrutinized every charge, and became anxious about spending money on anything beyond absolute necessities. Her therapist explained, this was a normal trauma response, but knowing that didn't make it easier to manage. Diana also struggled with trust in ways that affected her friendships and work relationships. She questioned people's motives, assumed everyone wanted something from her, and isolated herself emotionally. 6 months after the trial, Diana called me crying because she'd received a letter from Vanessa, the woman Graham had been seeing throughout his unemployment and theft. Vanessa wrote that she hadn't known Graham was married when they started their relationship, and she was horrified to learn the full extent of his crimes through news coverage of the trial. She explained that Graham had told her he was divorced and working as a freelance consultant. He'd been generous with money, taking her on trips and buying her gifts, and she'd never questioned where the money came from. When she saw the trial coverage and realized he'd been stealing from his wife to fund their relationship, she felt sick with guilt. Vanessa included a check for $8,000, roughly what she estimated Graham had spent on her directly, and apologized for her unwitting role in Diana's suffering. She'd broken up with Graham immediately after learning the truth, and was in therapy processing her own feelings about being manipulated. Diana didn't know how to feel about the letter or the money. Part of her wanted to reject it and tell Vanessa to keep her guilty conscience and her check. But another part recognized that Vanessa had also been lied to and manipulated, even if not to the same extent. Rebecca advised Diana to deposit the check and use it toward her recovery, and Diana eventually agreed. She wrote back to Vanessa thanking her for the gesture and explaining she didn't hold her responsible for Graham's actions. Vanessa replied with relief and gratitude, and they exchanged a few more messages before mutually agreeing to move forward separately. Diana said it gave her a small sense of closure, knowing that Graham had lied to everyone in his life, not just her. His capacity for deception wasn't a reflection of Diana's judgment, but of his fundamental character. That realization helped her start to forgive herself for not seeing the truth sooner. She'd been working 60-hour weeks saving lives while her husband systematically betrayed and stole from her. She'd done nothing wrong. A year after Graham's conviction, Diana started dating again, cautiously and with heavy boundaries. She met someone through a friend, a teacher named Colin, who had steady employment, verifiable history, and patience with her trauma responses. They took things extremely slowly, and Diana made him go through a background check which he agreed to without question. Colin understood that rebuilding trust would take time, and he never pushed for faster progression. Diana's therapist encouraged the relationship as part of her healing process, while also warning her to watch for red flags and trust her instincts. Slowly, Diana began to believe she might eventually have a healthy relationship again. She still had moments of panic when Colin was late responding to texts, or when she couldn't immediately verify where money in their shared date fund went. But those moments became less frequent and less intense as months passed. She was learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and trauma-driven paranoia. 2 years after everything imploded, Diana had rebuilt her savings to $40,000, paid off all the fraudulent debt, and was considering buying a small house. She'd been promoted to senior attending physician at her hospital and was mentoring younger doctors. She volunteered with an organization supporting survivors of financial abuse, sharing her story to help others recognize the warning signs she'd missed. Her relationship with Colin was steady and healthy, built on transparency and mutual respect. She still had difficult days when the trauma resurfaced unexpectedly, but she had tools to manage those moments now. Graham would be in prison for another 9 years, and Diana had moved on with her life in ways he never anticipated. She'd transformed her victimization into purpose, helping others avoid the same trap she'd fallen into. The sister I'd found breaking down in her filthy apartment 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more resilient than before. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.